So welcome to this, our Remembrance Sunday service for 2020. I am now going to light our chalice. I would like to give us these opening words from Peter Teets. Here we gather. We gather, as we always do, for the same reasons that we gather week after week. To lift up the gift of life that is ours. To remember that life is holy. To pray for healing and hope in the midst of trouble. To give thanks for the blessings that surround us. Today, especially, we lift these up. The gift of life, the holiness that surrounds us, the troubles and blessings, as we remember and honour those who have given themselves to the cause of war in its intensity and terror. We remember those who have given their lives in the hope of a new day of peace. In the quiet of our gathering, may we lift up our hearts in grateful thanksgiving for their lives and for the promise of peace that they mean. May it be so. We will now have a prayer for remembrance by Peter Teets. Remember them. They have lived their lives in service. They have left their loved ones. They have secured our freedom. They have been hated and despised. They have lost lives in service. They have been left fragile and broken. They have maintained our peace. They have been cheered and honoured. They are our brothers and our sisters. They are our sons and daughters. They are our mothers and fathers. They are our family, our children, our parents, our friends and our fellows. They are not forgotten. They will never be forgotten. They are remembered. Amen. These are the names of the fallen. The names of those from our congregation here at Newcastle upon Tyne Unitarians who gave their lives in the First and Second World Wars. Their names are inscribed within the Robinson Book, on the memorial plaques within our building, and within our memories. Let us remember them. From the First World War. Benjamin Carr, Edwin Coish, Frank Drinkhold, John E. Harrison, Carl Norton Levin, MC, George Newton, Henry H. Smith. From the Second World War. Morris Collingwood, Stanley Crawhall, William Curry, Angus B. Eads, John Taylor Ellis, John J. Headley, Ian Hamilton, Peter Lane, Raymond Martin, Tom McCall, Ronald Wilkin DSO, William Lucas Walters, John R. Walters MND, Thomas S. Neal. We will shortly join in the 2-minute silence across our country, sharing a moment of remembrance with all of our fellow Unitarians and our fellow citizens of the UK, to remember those who gave their lives for freedom. At this moment, in the Unitarian Chapel at Great Hucklow, home of the Nightingale Centre, one of the centres of UK Unitarianism, a service is being held to commemorate the fallen. At the back of that chapel are plaques commemorating the fallen of many congregations. Among them are those from Tyneside. As part of that, we did research to find out the names of all of those we could. This is the fullest list of those we have from Tyneside who gave their lives in the First and Second World Wars. We will now take a few moments of silent prayer and meditation. Then the 2-minute silence will happen at 11 a.m. Thank you. The topic of today's service is remembrance and imagination. We'll shortly have a poetry reading, which Ben and Diana have offered to share between them. The poem is called The Ramparts of the Dead, Advice from the 1%. So I will now unmute Diana and Ben. I think you will need to unmute yourselves.
The Ramparts of the Dead, Advice from the 1%. Whether you sport the badge of Lancaster, rather than that which marks the House of York, should you spit on both their martial causes, or keeping your head down like a cloistered clerk, do what those well-fed scribblers call work. Remember the unlucky 1%. Still quartered amongst the fields, who won't be giving evidence except to God. In this their sacrificial testament, the living fought on the ramparts of the dead.
Folk talk about the heat of battle, but those who gab aren't those who go to war. We who were destined to experience it, hour on the mutually murderous hour of hand-to-hand brutality, are here. I tell you, warmth was absent from the scene, a freezing gale that numbed us to the bone. Cold steel, cold comfort, killing in cold blood, snow flurries, arrow hail, relentless pain.
Survivors fought on ramparts of the dead. Some of us succumbed to suffocation, our breath squeezed from us in the ruthless press. Still more from exposure, dehydration, than those who fell to blades' releasing kiss. Earth became mud bath, and the trampled grass absorbed the residue of flattened flesh. Our forms dismembered in the mangled crush, which rats and ravens subsequently made a banquet, transcending the devilish, as vermin fought on ramparts of the dead.
The favoured 99% of you, whom helpful destiny provided with something more satisfactory to do on that Palm Sunday, draw the grateful breath denied us in the slaughter's aftermath. Accept the counsel of our shattered skulls, broadcast across now silent Yorkshire hills. Settle dynastic differences indeed, but not like us ungovernable fools. Don't ever fight on the ramparts of the dead.
An introduction to our next reading, which is Our Most Brutal Battle by Martin Kettle. Before I start reading, I'd like to ask everyone to ponder a question. In your view, what was the worst battle in English history? Take a moment to think about the answer. And now, it may seem incongruous with today's service and perhaps with the question I've just asked, but I'd like to ask everyone to picture a Ford Anglia, or a Ford Escort if that's easier, being driven by a man with his wife in the seat next to him, with 2 boys and a girl in the back. The car is travelling along the road from West Yorkshire to the East Coast for a family day at the beach. The children look out of the window and spot a small church and wait for their mother to say what she usually says at this point in the journey. That's where the river ran red. I have to confess I have no idea what anyone else said at this point, whether the children were interested or bored, or whether the man said anything himself. I wasn't there, for reasons that will become immediately apparent when I say that the younger of the two boys was my dad, aged about 8 years old. Why did my grandmother say this? Our second reading explains the history. Martin Kettle begins. A group of us, all intelligent, well-educated and middle-aged, were sitting around the table just the other day when I mentioned a fact that I'm always surprised is so little known. And none of the rest of the group knew anything about it either. This week, I asked a few of my colleagues at random what this thing meant to them. Once again, I drew a blank. So here's my question. What does the word Towton mean to you? If you have the answer, I'm glad, because you should. But if you don't, you are in very good company. It nevertheless says something about us as a nation that you are far more likely not to know anything about Towton than to know instantly what it is. And here is the answer. Towton is a village about 10 miles southwest of York. It owes what fame it has to the fact that it was once the scene of a battle. But this was not just any battle. At the Battle of Towton, more English people were killed than on any other day ever. And by ever, I do mean ever. It is often said that the bloodiest day in our history was July the 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, when over 19,000 soldiers went over the top and were mown down by German machine guns. As a result, the Somme has become synonymous with the frightful, mindless slaughter of a whole generation of young British men. It traumatized the survivors so much that they barely spoke of it, but it hangs over our country still, over a century later. Merely to think of it can make one weep. Yet Towton was bloodier than the Somme. When night fell on March the 29th, 1461, it was Palm Sunday, and much of the battle took place in a snowstorm. The Yorkist and Lancastrian dead numbered more than 20,000. It should be said that the figures are much disputed and rise to as many as 28,000 in some accounts. And there were countless men wounded besides, many of whom probably died of their injuries not long after the battle. Now let us remember two other things whilst we absorb this. Firstly, that whilst the population of Britain in 1916 was more than 40 million, that of England in 1461 was considerably less than 4 million, so the proportionate impact on the country must have been seismic. 1 in every 100 Englishmen, the 1% of the poem we heard earlier, 1 in every 100 died at Towton. Its impact must have been a bit like an English Hiroshima. And secondly, that this being 1461, not a shot was fired. This was not industrial killing from a distance. Every Englishman who died at Towton was pierced by arrows, stabbed, bludgeoned or crushed by another Englishman. As a scene of hand-to-hand human brutality on a mass scale, Towton has absolutely no equal in our history. It was our very own day of wrath. Remembrance and imagination. You might be wondering why I mentioned the family in the car, other than to account for my own knowledge of the Battle of Towton. Several decades later, my father, now with his own family, took us on a walk around the site. He specialises in doing an impromptu guided walk of the battlefield for family and friends. He can point out the famous site of the Cock Beck River. There's a very short history of the battle. The Yorkist and Lancastrian sides faced each other in battle for 3 hours until the Yorkist army received reinforcements which turned the tide. The Lancastrians, sensing defeat, fled down what would become known as the Bloody Meadow towards the beck to escape the Yorkist soldiers, tearing off their insignia and armour as they went. By this point, what we now know as the War of the Roses had gone on for several years. Both sides had had their friends and family members killed by the other side, and before the battle, the order was given there would be no quarter. The cock beck is said to have run red with the blood of the dead, so many of whom fell into the river or were trampled underfoot by their fleeing comrades and were crushed or drowned, that those who escaped were said to have been able to run to escape their deaths, crossing on the backs of the dead. A quick search on the internet using the words Towton mass grave would give you more information about how vicious the fighting was. And yet many of us know little about Towton. It happened over 500 years ago. Why think about it now? This service was actually partly inspired by a conversation I had with Maurice Large, a long-standing member of our congregation and our former chairperson. We were talking in 2018 after the centenary of the First World War armistice, and the only thing I could think of to say at one point in the conversation was, what do we do now? The First World War has passed out of living memory. The Second World War is about to. There are not many survivors left who fought in that war. It won't be long before there are none. And I wonder, what are we going to remember? What's going to be the purpose of Remembrance Sunday when the last survivors are gone? Is it going to be reduced to a simple narrative in which we beat the Hun and then the Nazis? Much as Towton now lives really only in the memories of historians, but also in the folk memories of the local inhabitants, who have not forgotten that the river ran red half a millennium ago. Actually, at this point, you could quite rightly observe that the last survivors are not gone. Britain has been involved in over 20 wars and conflicts since the end of the Second World War. I wonder how many of us could name all of them. Yet we still focus on those two great wars of the last century, the conflicts which shaped our country and still do. But I fear that without the memories of the living to remind us how awful war can be, as a country, we'll focus only on what we want to remember, and we'll forget the horror and the complexity of what armed conflict really means. Martin Kettle, who we heard from earlier, writes in the next part of his article, Towton is not a secret. It's in the books and on the maps. If you visit, there is a memorial. The same river which was so packed with corpses that men fled across them from one bank to the other still runs through it. If you study the Wars of the Roses, you learn it was a decisive Yorkist victory. If you go online, you can discover some of the detective work done by the University of Bradford on mutilated skeletons exhumed from some of Towton's mass graves. And if you go to a performance of Henry VI Part 3, you'll see that our national poet himself set powerful scenes at Towton, where in the thick of battle, a father finds that he has killed his son, and a son finds that he has killed his father, and where the watching and hateless Lancastrian king wishes himself among the dead, saying, "For what is in this world but grief and woe?" Yet, though not a secret, Towton is largely now forgotten. It carries none of the civic weight that Gettysburg does in America. Of course, Towton was all much longer ago, although the much more distant Battle of Hastings is still remembered well enough. Perhaps the dynastic cause in which Towton was fought is simply too obscure, although plenty of people today can recall roughly what the much later battle at nearby Marsden Moor was about. Towton undoubtedly meant something to Shakespeare and his audience. He used it to warn against the great fear of the Tudor era, the catastrophe of civil strife. We don't have the same fear of civil war today. Such things belong to the past, where they did things differently. And yet, might something other than the fact that it all happened a long time ago partly explain our sustained expunging of Towton from our national memory? Perhaps Towton is simply too brutal, too senseless, and thus too traumatic to acknowledge today. I wonder whether Towton denial is even something we inherit, an experience we don't want to confront because its intensity and slaughter don't fit with our island story, our national self-esteem, and our enduring need for meaning and optimism. But when I think about the mindless killings of our own times, whether at home in the streets of our cities or abroad in the bombing of distant towns and villages, it seems clear that something of the savage spirit of Towton still lives on within us, even today, and we should know about it. I once asked my dad if my grandfather had ever said anything about the Battle of Towton. He couldn't recall that Grandpa Reeve ever had. I suppose I was curious about whether Grandpa, who served in an artillery battalion in Africa during the Second World War, might ever have found any kinship with those long ago soldiers. Probably not. I myself don't actually know very much about his experiences. Like many men of his generation, he didn't speak much about them. Partly, I think, because he wanted to put it behind him. Perhaps partly because, as a Scotsman of his generation, he simply didn't really like much to speak about his personal feelings. But also I wonder if it was because there was no way we, who hadn't been there, could really understand what it was like to fight in the Second World War. But we must try to understand, hence my title, Remembrance and Imagination. As the two great wars recede further into the past, we must strive to use our imagination to learn from works of art like Shakespeare's works and the poem we heard earlier by Peter Whiten, to try and remember what war is truly like, never to simplify or streamline, but to remember what we ask others to face on our behalf. Remembrance Sunday isn't going to be renamed Imagination Sunday anytime soon, and nor should it be, because we have many veterans and shattered lives still among us. The bereaved of conflict are still with us, and we must always remember them and strive to support them. The dead and wounded of the Afghan War, the Iraq War, and many others are still part of our island history, and we must never forget. And so as part of that, as part of our tribute, let us stop and remember. And where we cannot remember, imagine what war truly is. Let us never forget. And now we reach the end of our service, of our time together. I will put out our chalice. As ever, when we put out the chalice, its physical flame may go out, but its light burns within us all and guides us until we are able to meet once more. And now I have some closing words. Deep Within You by Reverend Andy Pakula. There is a place of peace, a place of wisdom, a place of love. May this sacred centre be our guide. May it be our strength for the journey. May it fill us with hope when all seems hopeless. And may it lead us to know the sacredness in all. May it be so.